have a short amount of time today, so I think we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully as people sign in, we can just catch them up to speed. But I want to say thank you, first of all, to the independent sector for the opportunity to be with all of you this morning. This is a Spark Talk format, and so the way it's set up is I'll spend maybe the first half of the session sharing some of my thoughts or ideas, but then I really would love to open it up to conversation on screen in chat to get your reactions to what I'm sharing. So let me start off by just saying that my name is Edward Tephorn. I'm the executive director at the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. The foundation is the primary nonprofit partner working in partnership with Angel Island State Park to help preserve the National Historic Landmark there that was once a former U.S. immigration station. And the land that Angel Island sits on the ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok people. And it's not lost on me as I'm sharing with you today about how data and histories for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities is invisible, that the data and history of indigenous peoples is also invisible, and that of many other marginalized groups. And so hopefully our conversation today helps us all think about how we can lift up these invisible histories, not just for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, but also for indigenous people and for all these other communities whose histories have yet to be fully told. If you would like to tweet along as we go this morning, I've got all the different various social media handles located on the screen there. And I think the hashtag for the conference is Upswell 2021. And if you haven't had a chance to respond to the poll yet, if you could just take a quick few seconds to do that now. The question is, how much did you learn about Angel Island in your U.S. history classes? And we'll leave that poll open for just another 10 seconds, and then we'll see what the results look like. All right, so let's go ahead and end the poll, Jess. And I want to do a shout out to Jess Payton with Independent Sector. Thank you so much for helping to assist me with the session today. So at least from what I can see on the poll, for those of us that responded, 100% said that we learned a very low amount. And that's actually not different from my own experiences. I am an immigrant. I was born in Bangkok, Thailand, but came to Texas in the early 1970s. And growing up in Texas, I definitely did not learn anything about Angel Island in class. I didn't learn about it in college. It wasn't until as an adult that I learned about this really dark chapter of American history and immigration history. So often when we think about immigration, our mind immediately turns to the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, which of course stand as beautiful symbols of our country's welcome of immigrants. But Angel Island which has also been called the Ellis Island of the West, is a reminder of a darker chapter where our country has specifically tried to historically keep out specific groups of immigrants and to keep them from becoming U.S. citizens. And this group historically was the Asian and Pacific Islander community. So in the time that we have together this morning, I've chunked it out into 3 different sections. First, I'll share a little bit about the history of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders that we often are not taught in U.S. history classes. In the second section, I'll dive a little bit more into the specific histories of the former U.S. immigration station at Angel Island. And then for the remainder of the time, I have 2 questions that I would love for us to have the opportunity to all engage in discussion with. And so here I'll be inviting those of you who feel comfortable to turn on your mics and your video and get on screen and share your thoughts. Or if you prefer to interact via chat, that's wonderful as well. So why are we talking about history in a health equity conference? And so for me, I think of health in a very broad definition, drawing from the Healthy People 2020-2030 definitions of social determinants of health. There is this part of health that's related to social and community context, and particularly within that category of health, the thought of social cohesion, the degree to which a community feels included or in solidarity with the community around it. And unfortunately, when it comes to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, when we look at our health data, when we look at the history, when we look at even how these communities are currently thought of, there are three dominant stereotypes and narratives that our communities are typically framed in. The first is that of the invisibility or the other. And so that's how our communities are often missing from textbooks, or in how different health reports and data and charts and graphs, when we're talking about different morbidity and mortality for different diseases. I've often seen a chart where it says, here's such and such data, diabetes data, HIV data, obesity data, by race ethnicity, but then the only race ethnicities for whom data is shown are white, Black, and Latino, Latina. Often indigenous data or Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Island data is completely missing from those charts and graphs, or they're lumped into a meaningless other category. The second narrative or frame is that of the perpetual foreigner. And that's this narrative where, regardless of how long I or my family or my community has lived here in the US as an Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, we're not always seen as being fully American. And so that, I think, is something that definitely is connected to the history of Angel Island and unfortunately continues on till today. And then the third narrative is that of the model minority myth. And so that's just this false stereotype that all Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities are universally wealthy, well-educated, and healthy. And while that might seem like it's a positive stereotype, where it is definitely damaging to our communities is that we're not a monolithic community. We constitute 50 different groups that speak 100 different languages, each with our own histories, our own cultures, our own realities. And with this model minority myth, it makes invisible the segments of our communities that truly are struggling, either from health or other social determinant of health challenges. And it makes it that much harder for agencies and organizations trying to raise awareness or to provide needed services to these communities to get the attention, the funding that is really needed. The other nefarious part about the model minority myth is it was specifically designed to create a wedge between Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities and other racial ethnic communities. And so as I share some of these histories and some of this data today about the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, I definitely want to put the caveat out there that I'm not trying to engage in oppression Olympics. I'm not trying to say that what Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities are experiencing is any better or any worse than what other communities are experiencing. All I'm simply trying to do is to lift up some data and some histories that have for too long been invisible. And I hope that as I'm sharing this information, what we're able to look into and see are the threads of commonality, but also the unique differences between our communities. Because at the end of the day, our past, our current, and our future is all intertwined together. And it's so important for us to be aware of each other's data, to be aware of each other's history, and to stand in solidarity with each other as we work towards a healthier future. So diving first into some of these histories about anti-Asian Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander racism that has occurred over history, what you see on the screen, and I do want to offer a trigger warning that my slides do include depictions of people who've lost their lives, unfortunately, to anti-Asian Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander racism. But this racism and xenophobia tracks back to the first instances where Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders started coming to the US. And in the mid-1800s, with the discovery of gold in California, we definitely saw a huge increase in Chinese laborers coming to the US to help mine for gold. Once the gold rush ended, these Chinese laborers also helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. But once the railroad was completed, they weren't allowed to ride the railroad. They had to make their way back by foot or other means to the Western cities that they chose to reside in. And when they returned to those cities, unfortunately, due to the economic conditions, due to a poor job market, they were met with a lot of hostility. There's definitely records of anti-Asian lynchings, mob riots, arsons, and that's part of the roots of this anti-Asian racism and xenophobia in our country. Unfortunately, that violence also made its way into our country's laws and policies, in particular our immigration policies. And what started with the Page Act of 1875 that tried to label Chinese women as prostitutes and not worthy of entering the U.S. expanded into the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the very first time in our country that a specific country's citizens were barred from entering the U.S. As laborers or naturalizing to become U.S. citizens. And there were a few exceptions to that. Merchants, administrators or students, politicians were able to come in, though essentially similar to our immigration policies now. If you had means and wealth, then sometimes exemptions would be made. But if you did not have the luxury of that wealth, and you were a laborer, then you were not a wanted immigrant group. Ultimately, that Chinese Exclusion Act expanded over the next couple of decades into other immigration laws and policies where if you were from an Asian Pacific Islander country, you were essentially excluded from immigration to the US. There are a number of other Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander histories that I know I was never taught in school, and I'm curious to hear if you were taught. One is that of the history of Hawaii. And so in school, I did definitely learn that Hawaii is our 50th state, but I definitely did not learn that in order for Hawaii to become our 50th state, the independent Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown, and the US government had actually colluded with business owners to essentially usurp the land of Hawaiians to take advantage of the rich farmlands there. Similarly, we know that during World War II, there was Executive Order 9066 that led to Japanese incarceration across the U.S. And so I remember there was a paragraph that I learned in U.S. history class. But what I didn't learn about was the scale of that incarceration and how each number represents an individual, a family who was impacted. And I definitely didn't learn about the economic impact of how it's estimated at the low end that the Japanese community lost over $400 million in personal and business property due to that incarceration. I didn't learn about our nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, where after World War II, we dropped over 67 nuclear test bombs in the Marshall Islands, which is a U.S.-affiliated Pacific Island jurisdiction. And one of those bombs happened to have 67 times the nuclear power of the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima, which in of itself was already an egregious event. And that testing in the Marshall Islands has led to significant health and economic conditions for the Marshallese population. The U.S. military also, without the informed consent of the Marshallese, conducted testing on the Marshallese in terms of the after effects of that radiation exposure. And then starting about 40 or 50 years ago, we've also seen a slate of unfortunate violent attacks that have led to the deaths of many Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. Vincent Chin, who you see on the left-hand side, his death in Detroit, Michigan is often seen as one of the culminating events where the Asian Pacific Islander community came together to fight back against the injustice, where his three killers never spent a second of jail time or of prison time for their crimes. Similarly, Filipino-American Joseph Alito in Los Angeles lost his life to a white supremacist. And these are just two examples. There are many more examples. After 9/11, we definitely saw an increase in xenophobia, anti-Muslim, anti-South Asian, anti-Arab American prejudice. We saw that culminate in 2012 with shootings at a Sikh Gurdwara, a religious institution in the Sikh community. And even last year, we saw the unfortunate killings in Atlanta of 8 people, including 6 Asian American women. And so we know that in the past 2 years, the number of anti-Asian attacks, there have been over 9,000 reported cases, and those are only the reported cases. But it's so important to remember that these attacks, this history of attacks is not new, and it has a history that traces back for decades. So let me dive a little bit into the history of the Angel Island Immigration Station. Angel Island is a beautiful scenic island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. And from 1910 to 1940, there was a U.S. immigration station that was established there in about 22 acres of the northeast corner. Over the next couple of slides, you'll see on the left-hand slide historic picture that shows what the station used to look like, and on the right-hand side, what the station looks like now. So the scene that you see on the left-hand side is what immigrants would see as soon as they landed at Angel Island. And so if you were Asian Pacific Islander, if you were if you were deemed to have a potential excludable medical condition, or if you were someone that the immigration officials thought would be likely to become a public charge or someone dependent on government for support, then instead of being able to land in San Francisco, you would be routed to Angel Island. Once there, we know that the experience for Asian detainees was different from non-Asian detainees. The Asians were separated from the non-Asians, the Chinese were separated from other Asians, and men and women were separated from each other. In the history of Angel Island, we also had women and children detained. If I'd been traveling with my mother and I was over the age of 12 years, I would have been separated from her and forced into the detention barracks with the other men and boys. On the right-hand side, you see the detention barracks in the background there, and that's where the male detainees were held. Female women and children detainees were held in the administration building, which would be in the foreground on the right-hand side, but unfortunately that building burned down in 1940. Part of the process was a medical screening, and we know for European and non-Asian immigrants, that was a pretty cursory medical screening. But for Asian immigrants, we were forced to strip completely naked and provide blood and stool samples. And that picture that you see on the left-hand side is a staged photo, a staged historic photo, because we know from historical accounts that Asian immigrants and detainees were forced to strip completely naked. On the right-hand side is what that room looks now, and it's a blank slate in our new Angel Island Immigration Museum that we'll be using to hold events as well as rotating exhibits that tell the continuing stories of immigration then and now. Immigrants were forced into really cramped conditions. You see that these, on the left-hand side, these metal barracks and bunks, and on the right-hand side, an exhibit recreating the cramped conditions. It's important to recognize that for European detainees, they often spent maybe 3 days to a week in detention at Angel Island, whereas for Asian detainees, they could spend anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months to up to 2 years was the longest period of detention recorded on Angel Island. And then finally, the interrogation process was very different for Asian immigrants. Chinese immigrants in particular would be asked hundreds upon hundreds of questions to try to verify their identity and their claims to be eligible to enter the US. And part of that was that there were exceptions, again, to the exclusion laws, where if you were a merchant, if you were a business person, or if you were the son or daughter of a US citizen, thanks to the US Supreme Court case of Wong Kim Ark versus the US, which established birthright citizenship. Those would be some of the exceptions that would allow a Chinese or other Asian Pacific Islander to be able to enter the US. All in all, over 500,000 immigrants from 80 different countries were detained or processed on Angel Island, and you see some of that diversity reflected on the pictures here. And so I want to move now into the discussion section of our talk today. And the two questions I want to focus on are: what other Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander histories are important to lift up? And what are you doing to help lift up those histories and data? And to start off the conversation, I just wanted to share a couple of ways that the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation is engaging in storytelling to lift up these histories related to Angel Island and to connect them to immigration that's happening today, not just by Asian Pacific Islanders, but the detention that's happening along the southern border, the immigrant communities and refugees and asylum seekers who are coming from Afghanistan and Haiti and other parts of the world that are experiencing some really challenging problems. So on the left-hand side, you see a graphic novel that was developed by Stanford University. And then on the right-hand side is a comic book that was developed by Image Comics and Thai-American Chinese writer Pornsak Pichitso. And I actually just had an opportunity to interview him this past Wednesday. We had a great conversation. If you go to our YouTube page, you'll have a chance to hear more about how he created this 1940s detective era comic book, but wove in historical facts and figures related to Angel Island, and actually took 5 pages out of his comic book to explain the history of Angel Island. Second is the use of music in storytelling. And so here, Jeff Klein and his daughter, Heather wrote a opera based on her grandmother's detention at Angel Island. Her grandmother was from Austria, escaped Nazi occupation through China, and was processed and detained temporarily on Angel Island. And then on the right-hand side, a new musical called Illegal by a recent Yale University grad who, while at school in Yale, wrote this rap musical based on his grandfather's detention through Angel Island. This is an animated video about Tyrus Wong, who was a Disney animator, and many of us who've seen Bambi will have seen Tyrus's work. And finally, this is a new storytelling exhibit I'm very excited about. We worked with SciArc and Angel Island State Park to do 3D laser scanning and high-res digital photography to create a virtual exhibit where people, if you're not able to visit Angel Island in person, you have an opportunity to visit virtually. So those are just some examples of how we're trying to engage in storytelling to lift up these histories. And with the time remaining, I want to open it up to the chat and see if anyone would like to respond to either of these 2 questions. What other histories are important to lift up, and how are you helping to lift up some of these histories and data? So feel free to raise your hand or type your responses into chat. Again, the questions are, what other histories were we not taught and are important to lift up? And how can we help and lift up these histories and data? All right, so it looks like people are a little shy this morning, and that's quite all right. What I would like to offer is there are a couple things. If you don't see something, say something. And so I can count if I would be a millionaire if I got $1 for every time I was at a conference or read through a report and didn't see Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander data. And so it's so I think it's the experience of so many of us that our data, our history is still invisible. So if you don't see that data or that history, then say something, and we can say it in a respectful way. Oh, here's the chat starting to come through. Let me see what some of y'all are mentioning. So Jamie mentions continuing to learn about the histories and share what we learned. That's wonderful, Jamie. And a challenge that I was actually going to issue to all of you was, would you be willing to talk to at least 3 other people about what you learned about Angel Island this morning? Bradley says, this is great. What is the best way to get more people to open their minds to these stories? That's, I think, the $1 million question, Bradley. I know for me, part of it is my own responsibility about learning about other people's histories as well as talking about our histories. And as an Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, it's so important for me to be speaking out, not just about what's happening to Asian Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian communities, but also what our brothers and sisters in the Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latinx, LGBT, differently abled, and even in the economically disadvantaged white communities are experiencing. So I think it starts with that curiosity, that empathy, that willingness to learn about other people's journeys. Micah or Mika, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name. I've been learning about Asian American activism during the civil rights movement, always empowering to hear about minority leaders lifting each other up. Exactly. There's beautiful examples of how our communities have supported one another that often we don't learn as well. And this goes, one of the things that I learned about in my 2 years working at Angel Island is that Frederick Douglass, as an abolitionist, even while fighting for the freedom of Blacks, is quoted in some of his speeches talking out against the anti-Chinese xenophobia and encouraging the opening of immigration laws to allow more Chinese to immigrate